In the sacred rhythm of the Islamic calendar, Shaban arrives quietly, like a bridge suspended between what has passed and what is about to come. It is not a month that demands attention through grand rituals or loud announcements, yet it carries a depth that has moved hearts for centuries. Those who pause in Shaban often discover that it is a month of preparation, refinement, and subtle openings, a time when sincerity weighs more than quantity and intention shapes destiny. Within this month lies a simple act of worship that appears small in form yet vast in consequence, the offering of just 2 rakahs of prayer, performed with presence, humility, and hope. These 2 rakahs are not about innovation or extravagance, they are about returning to the essence of servitude, where a servant stands before the Creator with nothing but need and trust. Human beings often associate the impossible with distance. When a problem has lasted too long, when doors have remained closed despite repeated effort, when prayers seem unanswered and patience begins to thin, the heart quietly labels certain outcomes as unreachable. The word impossible is born not from reality but from exhaustion. Shaban arrives at precisely this point, reminding the believer that what appears fixed and immovable to the human eye is never so in the divine scheme. The month carries the scent of mercy, and within that mercy, even the smallest sincere act can become the turning point of a long struggle. 2 rakahs in Shaban are not magical by number, but transformative by meaning, because they redirect the heart from despair to expectation. When a person stands to pray these 2 rakahs, the first shift that occurs is internal. The body may be standing in a familiar posture, reciting verses known by heart, yet something deeper is taking place. In Shaban, the soul is invited to slow down, to recognize that Ramadan is approaching and that life itself is fragile and fleeting. The prayer becomes less about routine and more about conversation. Each verse recited feels like a confession of weakness and a declaration of reliance. The bowing acknowledges limits, and the prostration dissolves pride. In this space, the impossible begins to soften, not because circumstances have changed yet, but because the heart has reoriented itself toward the one for whom nothing is impossible. What gives these 2 rakahs their particular weight in Shaban is the spiritual climate of the month. Shaban has long been understood as a time when deeds are raised, intentions are refined, and hearts are prepared for the intensity of Ramadan. It is a month that encourages quiet acts done away from display. A prayer offered in this month carries the sweetness of anticipation, as though the soul is rehearsing its return to deeper devotion. When someone prays these 2 rakahs with the intention of seeking relief, guidance, or a breakthrough, they are aligning themselves with this current of mercy. They are saying without words that they believe change is possible even now, even after everything. The idea that 2 rakahs could shift what seems impossible challenges the way many people think about effort and reward. In the material world, greater results usually require greater visible effort. Spiritually, however, the scale is different. Sincerity can outweigh volume, and a moment of true humility can eclipse years of distracted action. In Shaban, when the heart is already leaning toward reflection, these 2 rakahs can become a container for years of unspoken pain, unfulfilled dreams, and silent prayers. They gather everything the person has been carrying and place it gently before the divine, trusting that nothing presented in this way is ignored. There is also a subtle healing that takes place through this prayer. Often the weight of the impossible is not just the external situation but the internal damage it causes. Repeated disappointment can harden the heart or fill it with quiet resentment and doubt. Standing in prayer interrupts this cycle. It creates a moment where the believer steps out of the story they have been telling themselves and steps into a larger reality. In prostration, the heart remembers that it has a Lord who hears even what is not spoken aloud. This remembrance alone can lift the burden, even before any visible change occurs. Shaban teaches that preparation is itself a form of mercy. Just as the body prepares for physical exertion, the soul prepares for spiritual elevation. These 2 rakahs act as a signal to the heart that change is welcome and that transformation is not reserved only for grand moments like the nights of Ramadan. They remind the believer that every step toward the divine is already a response to an invitation. When a person prays with this awareness, they begin to notice subtle shifts in perception. Problems that once felt overwhelming begin to feel manageable. Delays that once felt like rejection begin to feel like timing. The impossible begins to lose its grip, not through denial but through trust. Another dimension of these 2 rakahs is the way they reconnect the believer to hope. Hope in the Islamic tradition is not blind optimism, it is a disciplined expectation rooted in knowledge of divine attributes. Shaban, with its emphasis on mercy and preparation, nourishes this kind of hope. When someone prays in this month, they are not demanding outcomes, they are expressing confidence in divine wisdom. This confidence has a quiet power. It steadies the heart, calms the mind, and allows patience to take root. From this place even waiting becomes an act of worship, and the journey toward resolution becomes meaningful. The simplicity of the act is also part of its beauty. 2 rakahs do not require special circumstances, long hours or public recognition. They can be prayed in the stillness of the night, or the softness of early morning, when distractions are few and sincerity comes more easily. This accessibility reinforces an important truth. Closeness to the divine is not reserved for the elite or the learned. It is available to anyone willing to stand, bow and prostrate with honesty. In Shaban, this truth feels especially near, as though the month itself is encouraging each believer to take that small but significant step. As these 2 rakahs are repeated over the days of Shaban, they begin to shape the believer's inner landscape. Prayer is no longer a task to complete but a refuge to return to. Each time the believer stands, they bring a little more trust, a little more surrender. Over time, this accumulation of sincerity creates a readiness for Ramadan, where discipline and devotion intensify. The heart that has tasted the sweetness of quiet prayer in Shaban enters Ramadan softer, more attentive, and more hopeful. In this way, the 2 rakahs are not an isolated act, but part of a larger spiritual journey. The transformation described as making the impossible possible does not always arrive in dramatic form. Sometimes it comes as clarity instead of resolution, strength instead of immediate relief, or acceptance instead of sudden change. Yet these outcomes are not lesser, they are often exactly what is needed. Shaban teaches that divine generosity does not always match human expectations, but it always serves human growth. When the believer understands this, they begin to see every response as meaningful. The heart remains open, receptive, and willing to continue turning back in prayer. There is also a communal dimension, even when the act itself is private. When individuals reconnect with prayer and hope, they carry that energy into their relationships and responsibilities. A person who feels supported by divine mercy becomes more patient with others, more generous in spirit, and more resilient in hardship. In this way, the quiet act of praying 2 rakahs in Shaban ripples outward, influencing not just personal circumstances, but the emotional and spiritual environment around the believer. What once felt impossible on a personal level begins to shift collectively, as hearts soften and intentions realign. As Shaban progresses, the awareness of time deepens. The believer senses that opportunities are passing, and that moments of sincerity should not be delayed. These 2 rakahs become a daily reminder that change does not require perfection, only presence. Each prayer is an acknowledgement that the believer is still turning back, still hoping, still trusting. This persistence itself is a form of success. It keeps the heart alive and responsive, ready to receive whatever unfolds next. In this continuous turning, the line between preparation and arrival begins to blur. Shaban no longer feels like merely a waiting room for Ramadan, but a meaningful destination in its own right. The believer realizes that transformation is already underway, that the act of standing in prayer has already altered something fundamental within. The impossible has not vanished, but it no longer dominates the imagination. It has been placed into a larger context, one where divine wisdom, timing and mercy are active forces. From this perspective, every prayer naturally leads to the next. Every moment of sincerity opens the door to deeper reflection, and the heart continues forward, carrying this quiet certainty into whatever comes after. Already leaning toward the next unfolding reminder, the next invitation to draw closer, the next gentle step that follows seamlessly from this one, as the journey continues without pause, without closure, and without the need for an ending, because the turning itself never truly stops. Shaban is a month that often passes unnoticed by those who are rushing through life, yet for the attentive heart it carries a quiet intensity. It sits between what has been and what is about to arrive, offering a rare pause where reflection becomes possible and intention can be reshaped. In this month, even small actions take on amplified meaning, and among these actions, the offering of 2 rakat of prayer stands out as a subtle but life-altering secret. not because of form alone but because of what those moments can awaken within a person who approaches them with sincerity. These 2 rakat are not about ritual complexity, they are about reconnecting with purpose at a time when the soul is especially receptive. Life-changing moments are often imagined as dramatic turning points, yet in reality they frequently begin quietly. A person may reach a stage where outward success has not brought inner peace, or where repeated hardship has drained enthusiasm and hope. Shaban enters at such moments like a gentle reminder that transformation does not always announce itself loudly. Sometimes it begins with standing still, facing the direction of prayer, and acknowledging one's dependence. In those 2 rakat, the heart is given permission to slow down and speak honestly, without performance or pretense. This honesty is where change begins, because it dissolves the layers of distraction that have built up over time. The secret embedded in these 2 rakat lies in their timing as much as their intention. Shaban is traditionally understood as a month of preparation, a time when the heart is gradually oriented toward deeper awareness before the arrival of Ramadan. Praying during this month feels different because the atmosphere itself encourages reflection. When a person prays in Shaban, they are not only seeking immediate relief or guidance, they are aligning themselves with a broader rhythm of renewal. This alignment subtly shifts priorities. What once felt urgent may begin to feel secondary, and what once felt distant may begin to feel near. In these 2 rakat, the believer often discovers that the greatest change is internal. This is precisely what makes it powerful. Life-changing shifts that endure tend to grow quietly, rooted in consistency rather than intensity. Another dimension of this practice is the way it revives hope without making it fragile. Hope formed through prayer is not dependent on specific outcomes, it is grounded in trust. In Shaban, this trust feels especially natural, as the month encourages looking ahead without fear. The believer learns to hope broadly, leaving room for wisdom beyond personal plans. This expanded hope has a stabilizing effect. It allows a person to face uncertainty with composure, knowing that every sincere turn toward the divine carries value, even if the visible results are delayed. The 2 rakat also create a private space where the believer can confront what has been avoided. In daily life, distractions make it easy to ignore unresolved emotions, doubts, or regrets. Prayer removes those shields. Standing in stillness, the heart brings forward what it has been holding back. Rather than being overwhelming, this exposure becomes healing because it occurs in a context of mercy. Shaban reinforces the idea that acknowledgement is the first step toward renewal. In recognizing weakness, the believer finds strength, and in admitting confusion, clarity begins to form. This is why these 2 rakat are described as holding a life-changing secret. They do not promise an escape from hardship, but they offer a way to move through it differently. Over time, this shift affects decisions, relationships, and priorities. A person who regularly reconnects with prayer becomes more intentional, less reactive, and more aware of the transient nature of difficulties. This awareness does not detach them from life. It anchors them more firmly within it, guided by values rather than impulses. Shaban's role as a bridge month enhances this effect. Each prayer feels like a step closer to something greater, as though the heart is being gently trained for deeper devotion. The believer senses that what is being built now will support them later when demands increase and distractions multiply. In this way, the 2 rakat are not isolated moments but part of a continuum. They prepare the heart to receive what comes next with openness rather than resistance. As the days of Shaban unfold, the believer may notice an increasing readiness for change, an inner quiet that makes space for reflection. This readiness is itself transformative. It means the heart is no longer closed by habit or fear. The secret has done its work, not by altering circumstances overnight, but by reshaping the lens through which life is viewed. From this place, each subsequent act of worship flows more naturally, each moment of remembrance feels more meaningful, and the path ahead begins to reveal itself step by step, seamlessly leading into the next realization, the next practice, the next unfolding layer of connection that continues forward without interruption, inviting deeper understanding and carrying the journey onward into what is yet to be explored. There comes a point in many lives when the word impossible feels heavy and personal. It is no longer a concept but a label attached to unanswered prayers, delayed relief, or situations that refuse to change despite sincere effort. When someone reaches that point, the heart often oscillates between hope and resignation. Shaban arrives at this delicate stage. not as a dramatic intervention, but as a quiet invitation. It suggests that what feels impossible may not need to be fought harder, but approached differently. Within this month, the simple act of praying 2 rakat carries the potential to dissolve the very idea of impossibility, not through force, but through surrender. The power of these 2 rakat does not lie in their outward simplicity alone, but in what they awaken internally when performed in Shaban. This month softens the heart almost without notice. It creates an atmosphere where iron feels natural and sincerity feels safer. When a person chooses to stand in prayer during this time, they are responding to that atmosphere. They are acknowledging, perhaps without fully articulating it, that they are ready to let go of the belief that their situation is fixed. This readiness is often the first crack in the wall that has made the impossible feel permanent. In these 2 rakat, the believer confronts a fundamental truth. Impossibility exists only within human limitation. The act of standing, bowing and prostrating is a physical reminder that the human being is not the ultimate authority over outcomes. This reminder can be unsettling at first, especially for those accustomed to control, but it is also deeply liberating. As the body lowers itself in prostration, the heart releases some of the tension it has been carrying. That release does not erase the problem, but it changes the relationship to it. What once felt like an immovable weight begins to feel like something that can be entrusted. Shaban enhances this process by encouraging a shift in perspective. It is a month associated with preparation, a time when the believer begins to look ahead with intention, rather than anxiety. Praying 2 rakat in this context feels less like an emergency response, and more like a deliberate realignment. The believer is not only asking for change, they are preparing themselves to receive it, in whatever form it may come. This preparation often involves letting go of rigid expectations. When expectations soften, the heart becomes more receptive, and the impossible loses its grip. Another layer of transformation occurs through consistency. When these 2 rakat are not treated as a one-time attempt, but as a recurring return, they begin to reshape the inner narrative. Each prayer reinforces the message that turning back is always possible, and that hope does not expire. Over time, this repetition weakens the emotional charge attached to the problem. The belief, one may still desire resolution, but desperation is replaced by steadiness. This steadiness is crucial because it allows clarity to emerge where panic once dominated. The idea that the impossible can end through such a simple act challenges common assumptions about effort and reward. Many people believe that only extraordinary actions lead to extraordinary outcomes. Shaban quietly counters this belief by highlighting the value of sincerity over spectacle. 2 rakat offered with full presence can outweigh many distracted acts. They can become a space where the believer finally speaks honestly, even if that honesty takes the form of silence, tears, or a single repeated plea. In that honesty, barriers begin to fall, because there is no longer a need to pretend strength that is not there. Emotionally, these 2 rakat offer relief in a way that few other practices can. They provide a structured pause in which the believer steps out of the constant mental loop of worry and analysis. For those burdened by the impossible, this pause is often the first taste of peace they have experienced in a long time. That peace may be brief at first, but it leaves an impression. It shows the heart that calm is possible, that not every moment must be consumed by the problem. This realization alone can feel like an ending to something that has lingered far too long. Shaban's position before Ramadan adds another dimension to this experience. The believer senses that something greater is approaching, and that these moments of prayer are part of a larger journey. This awareness encourages patience. Instead of demanding immediate results, the heart becomes willing to walk step by step. The impossible begins to unravel not all at once but gradually, as trust replaces fear and intention replaces impulse. Each prayer strengthens this process, reinforcing the belief that nothing presented sincerely is wasted. There is also a subtle redefinition of success that occurs through these 2 rakat. Success is no longer measured solely by visible change, but by inner alignment. The believer begins to value calm over control, clarity over certainty, and connection over outcome. When this shift takes place, many of the things once labeled impossible lose their emotional dominance. They may still exist, but they no longer define the believer's state. This is often when external change begins to follow, almost as a reflection of the internal transformation. As Shaban continues, the believer may notice that their prayers feel different. Words come more easily, silence feels less empty, and trust feels more natural. The heart is being trained gently and steadily, to rely on something greater than its own calculations. In this reliance, the ending of the impossible does not feel like a dramatic victory, but like a quiet release. It feels as though a chapter has closed without needing to be announced. This release creates space for something new to emerge. When the heart is no longer consumed by what cannot be, it becomes curious about what might be. This curiosity is not anxious, it is open and receptive. The believer stands in prayer not just to ask, but to listen, to sense direction, to become aware of subtle guidance. From here, the journey naturally moves forward, carrying the calm, the trust, and the softened expectations into the next phase, where prayer deepens further, intention sharpens, and the heart continues to unfold toward the next realization that flows seamlessly from this one, already preparing for what lies ahead without pause or separation. Shaban carries a special kind of stillness, one that invites the heart to listen more closely than usual. In this month, people often speak of a wazifa, a focused spiritual practice performed with intention and consistency, not as a formula, but as a means of alignment. Among the simplest yet most profound of these practices is the offering of just 2 rakat of prayer. On the surface it appears almost modest to be associated with something as vast as a turning of destiny, yet this contrast is precisely where its power lies. The idea that something so small can have such far-reaching impact challenges the way destiny itself is understood. Destiny is often imagined as fixed, written and distant, something unfolding beyond personal influence. Yet lived experience shows that inner shifts frequently precede outer change. Shaban, as a month of preparation and mercy, emphasizes this truth quietly. When a person commits to praying 2 rakat during this time with awareness and sincerity, they are not attempting to rewrite fate through effort alone. Instead, they are repositioning themselves within it. This repositioning can feel subtle at first, almost imperceptible, but it gradually alters the way life is met, decision by decision, moment by moment. The wazifa of these 2 rakat begins with intention. Intention is not a sentence spoken aloud, but a direction set within the heart. In Shaban, intentions tend to emerge more honestly because the soul is already leaning toward reflection. When someone stands for prayer in this state, they often bring with them a mixture of hope and weariness, trust and uncertainty. Rather than being a weakness, this mixture becomes the very substance of the prayer. It allows the believer to show up as they are, without masking fear or exaggerating faith. In this honesty, the prayer becomes alive. As the 2 rakat unfold, something begins to shift internally. The recitation slows, not necessarily in pace but in meaning. Words that were once familiar take on new weight. Bowing becomes an acknowledgement of limits, and prostration becomes a moment of release. This physical lowering mirrors an internal surrender, where the believer loosens their grip on rigid expectations. Destiny begins to feel less like an opposing force, and more like a path that can be walked with trust, rather than resistance. What makes this practice especially potent in Shaban is the month's role as a transition. It is not an ending, nor is it a beginning in the dramatic sense. It is a passage, and passages invite adjustment. Praying 2 rakat as a wazifa during this time aligns the believer with that sense of movement. Instead of feeling stuck, they begin to feel in motion, even if circumstances remain unchanged. This sense of movement is often the first sign that something deeper is shifting. Over days or weeks, the effect of this practice accumulates. The believer may notice changes that are not immediately dramatic but undeniably real. A calmer response to stress, a clearer sense of priorities, a renewed patience with delays. These are not coincidences. They are reflections of an inner realignment. When the heart becomes steadier, decisions become wiser, and when decisions change, outcomes often follow. In this way, what is described as destiny turning is often the natural result of a transformed inner state meeting life differently. The simplicity of the wazifa is essential to its sustainability. 2 rakat do not overwhelm the schedule or demand extraordinary circumstances. They can be offered consistently, even on difficult days, and it is this consistency that deepens their impact. Each time the believer returns to prayer, they reinforce the message that change is possible and that connection is always available. Over time, this repetition builds resilience. The heart becomes less reactive, less prone to despair, and more anchored in trust. Emotionally, this practice provides a safe space for processing what has been suppressed. Many people carry silent fears about their future, their sustenance, their relationships, or their sense of purpose. In daily life, these fears are often pushed aside in the rush to function. The 2 rakat in Shaban create a pause where these concerns can surface without judgment. Presented within prayer, they lose some of their sharpness. The believer is reminded that they are not alone with their questions, and this reminder itself can feel like a turning point. Another aspect of this wazifa is the way it reframes effort. Instead of striving endlessly for control, the believer learns to pair action with reliance. This balance reduces burnout and restores perspective. When life is approached from this place, even setbacks feel different. They are no longer immediate proof of failure, but part of a process that is still unfolding. Destiny, once feared as rigid, begins to feel responsive, not because it bends to desire, but because the believer is learning to move in harmony with it. Shaban's proximity to Ramadan adds depth to this experience. The believer senses that these 2 rakat are preparing them for something greater, that the discipline and awareness cultivated now will support them later. This sense of preparation infuses the practice with meaning. Each prayer feels like laying a foundation, strengthening the heart for increased devotion and responsibility. The idea of destiny turning becomes less about sudden miracles and more about readiness for what is coming. As this readiness grows, subtle opportunities often become visible. The believer may notice guidance where confusion once dominated, or openings where doors once seemed closed. These changes may not be dramatic enough to announce, but they are unmistakable to the one experiencing them. They confirm that the practice is working not by bypassing reality, but by engaging with it more consciously. Destiny is not overturned, it is encountered with clarity. The most profound change brought by this wazifa is often a renewed sense of trust. Trust that effort matters, that prayer is heard, and that timing carries wisdom. This trust stabilizes the heart and allows it to remain open even in uncertainty. From this openness, deeper supplication begins to flow naturally, no longer confined to specific requests, but expanding into a broader dialogue of hope, gratitude and longing. At this point, the 2 rakats cease to feel like a method and begin to feel like a meeting place, where the believer stands ready for whatever unfolds next, already leaning toward the next expression of mercy. The next unanswered, yet hopeful plea. The next moment where what once felt distant begins to draw closer, seamlessly giving rise to a deeper question, a stronger prayer, and an even greater expectation that continues to grow and move forward into the next unfolding. Reminder, without pause, there are moments in a believer's life when a dua feels too heavy to utter, not because it lacks sincerity, but because it has been carried for so long without an answer. Such a dua gradually earns the label of impossible. It becomes something whispered with hesitation or avoided altogether out of fear of disappointment. Shaban enters gently into this space, offering not a promise of instant fulfillment, but a shift in how the heart approaches what it has nearly given up on. In this month, the act of praying 2 rakat opens a door many thought was permanently closed, not by force, but through mercy that works quietly and deeply. The question of whether an impossible dua can be accepted is not new. It arises whenever human limitation clashes with human hope. What Shaban does differently is soften that clash. It creates an environment where the believer is invited to return to prayer without the pressure of results. When 2 rakat are prayed in this month, they are not performed as a transaction, but as a return to humility, to trust, and to the understanding that acceptance does not always look the way the heart expects. This understanding itself begins to untangle the knots that made the dua feel impossible. In these 2 rakat, the believer stands with a history of waiting. Every unanswered plea, every delayed outcome, every moment of doubt is present, even if unspoken. Yet the posture of prayer reframes this history. Instead of standing as someone demanding resolution, the believer stands as someone seeking closeness. This shift is subtle but profound. When closeness becomes the goal, the heart relaxes. It stops measuring worth by outcomes and starts recognizing value in the act of turning itself. In that space, the dua is no longer burdened by expectation, it becomes honest again. Shaban's spiritual atmosphere plays a crucial role in this process. It is a month associated with elevation of deeds and preparation of hearts. When dua is made within this context, it feels held rather than exposed. The believer senses that this is a time for refining intention rather than testing limits. Praying 2 rakat here feels like stepping into a current already moving toward mercy. The dua may be the same words repeated countless times before, but now they are spoken from a place of surrender rather than strain. What is often described as a miracle in this context is not always the sudden appearance of the desired outcome. More often, it is the transformation of the one making the dua. The heart that once trembled with fear of rejection begins to steady. The mind that once replayed worst-case scenarios begins to quiet. This internal change is not insignificant. It is the soil in which acceptance grows. A dua made from calm trust carries a different weight than one made from desperation, and Shaban gently guides the believer toward that calmer state. The 2 rakat serve as a container for this shift. They provide structure without rigidity, allowing the believer to bring everything they are carrying into a defined moment of connection. Within those moments, time seems to slow. The believer is no longer racing ahead to imagine outcomes or replaying past disappointments. They are simply present. Presence is powerful because it restores sincerity. When sincerity returns, the dua regains its purity, and purity is often the missing element in prayers weighed down by fear. As this practice is repeated in Shaban, the believer may notice that the dua itself begins to evolve. Requests become more open-ended, less tied to a single outcome. The heart starts asking not only for relief, but for guidance, not only for fulfillment, but for wisdom. This evolution is not a loss of hope, it is a refinement of it. The believer is learning to trust that what is given will be better suited than what was imagined. In this trust, the label of impossible begins to dissolve. Emotionally, these 2 rakat provide a safe place to process disappointment without being consumed by it. The believer can acknowledge pain without letting it define the future. In prayer, grief and hope are allowed to coexist. This coexistence is healing because it reflects reality rather than denying it. Shaban supports this honesty, reminding the believer that preparation includes facing what has hurt and choosing to turn toward mercy anyway. There is also a quiet courage that develops through this practice. Continuing to pray for something that feels impossible requires vulnerability. It means risking disappointment again. Shaban encourages this courage by shifting the focus from outcome to effort. The believer learns that showing up matters, even when certainty is absent. This lesson carries forward, strengthening the heart not just for this dua, but for all future trials. As days pass, signs of acceptance may appear in unexpected forms. A sense of peace replaces restlessness. Clarity emerges where confusion once reigned. New opportunities or perspectives arise that were previously unseen. These are not always recognized immediately as answers, but they mark movement. The dua is no longer stagnant. It is alive, unfolding in stages. The believer begins to sense that acceptance is not a single moment, but a process, and that process has already begun. Shaban's role as a bridge to what follows adds another layer of meaning. The believer understands that these 2 rakat are not isolated acts but part of a larger preparation. The heart is being trained to receive more, to carry greater awareness, and to engage in deeper supplication. What once felt like a lost attempt now feels like the beginning of a more honest conversation. The dua continues not out of desperation but out of connection. In this state, the idea of a miracle becomes redefined. It is no longer limited to dramatic reversals of circumstance. It includes the miracle of resilience, the miracle of renewed trust, the miracle of continuing to turn back despite uncertainty. These miracles are quieter, but they are enduring. They prepare the believer for a deeper level of engagement with prayer, one where the focus shifts from asking alone to listening, from seeking outcomes to seeking understanding. From here, the journey naturally moves forward. The heart that has learned to bring its most difficult dua into 2 rakat in Shaban is ready to explore a deeper dimension of supplication, one where prayer becomes less about what is desired and more about who the believer is becoming. This readiness opens the door to a more intimate dialogue, where longing is expressed with confidence, silence becomes meaningful, and the next step in this unfolding path begins to take shape, seamlessly leading into a more profound encounter with hope, expectation, and the continued turning of the heart toward what lies ahead. Shaban holds a unique place in the spiritual journey, not through loud rituals or heavy obligations, but through quiet opportunities that soften even the hardest hearts. It is a month that invites the believer to slow down, to notice what has been neglected, and to return to the essence of worship with sincerity. Among its most special acts of devotion is the offering of 2 rakat of prayer, an act so simple in form that it is often underestimated, yet so deep in effect that it has the capacity to make even the most stubborn difficulties feel lighter. This special worship does not erase hardship instantly, but it changes how hardship is carried, and in that change, ease begins to emerge. Every person carries a set of struggles, some visible and some hidden. Over time, these struggles can harden into a constant background pressure, shaping thoughts, emotions and reactions. Shaban arrives like a gentle interruption to this pattern. It suggests that relief does not always require grand solutions, but a return to connection. When a person stands to pray 2 rakat in this month, they are stepping into a space designed for honesty. There is no need to impress, no need to perform. The prayer becomes a moment of refuge where the believer can acknowledge weakness without shame. The ease that flows from these 2 rakat begins internally. Before circumstances shift, the heart does. In prayer, the believer is reminded that difficulty is not faced alone. This reminder is powerful, because much of what makes hardship feel unbearable is the sense of isolation it creates. Bowing and prostration restore perspective. They place the believer back into a relationship where support is constant, even when answers are delayed. This restored perspective does not deny the reality of struggle, but it prevents struggle from defining the believer's entire experience. Shaban's spiritual atmosphere enhances this effect. It is a month associated with preparation and refinement, where small acts are given room to grow. Praying 2 rakat in this context feels different from routine prayer. There is an added sense of intentionality, a quiet awareness that these moments matter. The believer is not rushing through words, but allowing them to settle. Verses recited repeatedly in daily life take on fresh meaning, resonating with current emotions and concerns. In this resonance, comfort begins to form. One of the most profound ways these 2 rakat make difficulties easier is by reshaping expectations. Often hardship becomes heavier when it is accompanied by rigid timelines and imagined outcomes. Prayer gently loosens these attachments. In Shaban, the believer learns to place trust alongside effort. They continue to act in the world, but they no longer carry the full weight of results on their shoulders. This redistribution of burden brings immediate emotional relief. Problems may remain, but they no longer feel suffocating. Consistency deepens this ease. When these 2 rakat become a regular return point in Shaban, they establish rhythm. Rhythm creates stability, and stability creates resilience. The believer begins to face challenges with greater calm, knowing there is always a place to retreat and realign. This calm is not indifference, it is grounded engagement. From this grounded state, decisions become clearer, reactions soften, and conflicts lose some of their intensity. Ease begins to show up not as the absence of struggle, but as the presence of balance. Emotionally, this special act of worship provides a safe container for processing pain. Life often demands composure, leaving little room for vulnerability. Prayer opens that space. In 2 rakat, the believer can release what has been held in too tightly: frustration, fear, regret, and longing. Released within prayer, these emotions do not overwhelm. They are acknowledged and then gently entrusted. This act of entrusting is key to the easing of difficulty. It allows the believer to move forward without carrying the full emotional weight of every unresolved issue. Another aspect of this ease is the way prayer reframes hardship as meaningful rather than pointless. In Shaban, the believer is encouraged to view life as a preparation not just for Ramadan but for growth itself. Difficulties are no longer random obstacles, but opportunities for refinement. When this perspective takes root, struggle loses its sting. It becomes something that can be worked through with patience rather than resisted with frustration. The 2 rakat reinforce this perspective each time they are prayed, reminding the heart that growth often comes disguised as challenge. As the days of Shaban pass, the believer may notice subtle shifts that signal easing. Sleep becomes more restful, thoughts less scattered, and worries less intrusive. These changes are not always dramatic, but they are cumulative. Each prayer adds a layer of calm, a measure of clarity. Over time, this accumulation transforms the overall experience of life. What once felt overwhelming begins to feel manageable, and what once felt unbearable begins to feel temporary. The simplicity of this worship is what makes it sustainable. There is no barrier to entry, no requirement beyond willingness. This accessibility reinforces the idea that ease is not reserved for those with extraordinary capacity, but is available to anyone willing to turn back consistently. Shaban emphasizes this inclusivity, inviting every believer to participate in its quiet mercy. As this special worship continues, the heart becomes more receptive to deeper forms of supplication. The believer begins to listen as much as they ask. Silence in prayer becomes meaningful rather than awkward. Guidance is sensed not only in words, but in feelings of inclination and restraint. This deeper engagement prepares the heart for what follows, where prayer is no longer sought only for relief, but for closeness, understanding and direction. From this place of ease, difficulty and soft heart, the journey naturally extends forward. The 2 rakat have done their work, not by removing every obstacle, but by equipping the believer to move through them with trust and steadiness. This readiness opens the door to the next stage of devotion, where the focus shifts from easing hardship to deepening connection, from seeking solutions to seeking presence, and where the path continues seamlessly into a more intimate and sustained relationship with prayer, carrying all that has been learned into the unfolding moments that lie ahead.